There is a court that operates 24 hours a day inside your mind. And in this court, you are simultaneously the defendant, the prosecutor, and the judge. With every social interaction, every glance you interpret, every word you left unsaid, this court issues a relentless verdict: guilty. Have you ever noticed how certain thoughts about yourself arise automatically during social situations? Thoughts that make you feel as if you are fundamentally flawed, inadequate, or simply a bad person. These aren't just passing insecurities. They are deep patterns of the psyche that Carl Jung would call autonomous complexes, fragments of the shadow that operate independently of your conscious will. Jung discovered something revolutionary about human nature. What we most reject in ourselves does not disappear. On the contrary, it takes on a life of its own in the unconscious and returns as a symptom, as anxiety, as the persistent feeling of being judged. Social anxiety is not a disease. It is a messenger from the psyche, pointing to the parts of you that you cannot yet accept. What makes this even more cruel is that these thought patterns are invisible to ordinary consciousness. They operate like background programs, distorting every social experience, turning neutral encounters into evidence of your inadequacy. You walk into a room, and immediately the internal court is in session. Everyone is looking at you. They can see you don't belong here. You're going to say something wrong, and they'll find out who you really are. But here's what most people don't realize about social anxiety. It isn't about others. It never was. It's about the civil war happening inside your psyche between who you are and who you think you should be. It's about the aspects of your personality that you've exiled to the shadow and which now return as social ghosts, whispering that you are inadequate, that you are a fraud, that you are fundamentally flawed. Social anxiety feeds on non-integration. Every part of you that you consider unacceptable, every emotion you judge as negative, every trait you try to hide becomes fuel for the internal court. And this court never rests, never forgives, never acquits. You might be thinking that the solution is to simply stop having these thoughts. But Jung taught us something different. We don't fight the shadow. We integrate it. We don't eliminate destructive patterns. We become conscious of them. Because only that which becomes conscious can be transformed. Today, you will discover the 6 thought patterns of social anxiety that make you feel like a bad person. But more importantly, you will understand why they exist, how they were formed, and how they are, in fact, distorted attempts by the psyche to protect vulnerable parts of yourself. These patterns are not your enemies. They are disguised messengers, carrying precious information about the parts of your soul that need to be welcomed, accepted, integrated. But first, you need to see them clearly. Because only what is seen can be understood, and only what is understood can be transformed. Now, look directly into the mirror of your social experience. Don't look away. Don't hide behind rationalizations. Simply observe and acknowledge. How many times, after a seemingly normal conversation, have you found yourself ruminating over every word you said, convinced you revealed something terrible about yourself? How many times have you interpreted a silence as rejection, a glance as judgment, a laugh as mockery directed at you? You know that inner voice that whispers right after social interactions. They noticed you're weird. You talk too much. You shouldn't have said that. Now they know you're inadequate. This voice is so familiar that you probably don't even question its authority anymore. You simply believe it. But look deeper. When you feel that you are a bad person in social situations, what exactly is happening? You are projecting onto others the same relentless criticism you direct at yourself. The internal court that condemns your words, your expressions, your silences, your attempts to connect. You mentally rehearse conversations for hours because you're afraid your spontaneity will reveal who you really are. And who you really are in your distorted perception, is someone who doesn't deserve love, acceptance, or belonging. This is the great lie of social anxiety, that there is a right version of you that would be accepted, and a wrong version that must be hidden at all costs. Recognize this pattern. You constantly monitor your own reactions. You're always asking, how do I look? What are they thinking? Did I say the right thing? You have become the vigilant observer of yourself, the inner critic that never rests. And when you make the slightest social mistake, when you stutter, when you're at a loss for words, when you say something that doesn't sound perfect, the internal court issues its verdict. See? You really are inadequate. You really are a problematic person. You shouldn't even try. You cancel plans at the last minute because the anticipatory anxiety becomes unbearable. You avoid situations where you might be seen, judged, evaluated. But what you're really avoiding isn't others. You're avoiding a confrontation with the parts of yourself you consider unacceptable. The social shame you feel is the projected shadow. You reject aspects of your personality, your humanity, your natural imperfection, and then you project that rejection onto others. You assume they will reject you in the same way you reject yourself. As long as you feed these patterns, they grow. As long as you run from social discomfort, it intensifies. As long as you try to be an edited, controlled version of yourself, the anxiety strengthens. Do you recognize this dynamic? It's because you are operating from unconscious patterns that turn every social encounter into an opportunity to confirm your inadequacy. But these patterns have a structure. They follow specific logics. And when you understand these logics, when you illuminate these mechanisms with the light of consciousness, something fundamental changes. Are you ready to see the 6 patterns that keep this prison running? Because seeing them is the first step to breaking free from them. To understand why these thought patterns exist, you need to understand a fundamental law of the human psyche. What we reject in ourselves does not disappear, it becomes autonomous. Jung discovered that the human mind operates as a system of compensation. When you decide that certain parts of your personality are unacceptable, when you judge certain emotions as negative, when you condemn natural aspects of your humanity, these parts don't simply dissolve. They migrate to what Jung called the shadow. The shadow is the psychic repository of everything you consider incompatible with the image you want to maintain of yourself. And here's the crucial aspect. The shadow is not passive. It is an autonomous complex, a part of the psyche that operates with its own agenda, its own patterns, its own voice. Imagine your mind as an internal court where different voices compete for authority. There's the voice of the persona, which wants to be accepted and loved. There's the voice of the superego, which sets impossible standards. And there's the voice of the shadow, which whispers all the truths you don't want to hear about yourself. In social anxiety, this court becomes a destructive cacophony. The persona desperately tries to maintain a perfect facade. The superego criticizes every imperfection. And the shadow projects onto others all the judgments you make about yourself. The result is a negative feedback loop. The more you try to hide your imperfections, the more they become evident through anxiety. The more you try to control how others perceive you, the more disconnected you become from your authenticity. The more you reject parts of yourself, the more those parts sabotage your attempts at social connection. The thought patterns of social anxiety are, essentially, the voice of the unintegrated shadow. They are distorted attempts by the psyche to keep you safe, by avoiding the exposure of the parts you consider unacceptable. But this protection becomes a prison. Every thought that makes you feel like a bad person is a fragment of the shadow trying to get your attention. It's the psyche signaling that there is something unresolved, something that needs to be seen, accepted, integrated. But as long as you interpret these signals as evidence of your inadequacy, you will remain trapped in the cycle. Social anxiety functions like a dysregulated alarm system. It detects social threats where no real threats exist, because it's operating from unhealed wounds, from unconscious complexes, from aspects of your personality that have been exiled to the shadow. Understanding this changes everything. The destructive thoughts are not truths about you. They are symptoms of a psyche out of balance, trying to protect vulnerable parts through mechanisms that have become counterproductive. Healing doesn't come from eliminating these thoughts. It comes from understanding them, dialoguing with them, integrating the parts of your personality they represent. Because when you stop fighting your shadow and start integrating it, when you accept your imperfect humanity, instead of rejecting it, the internal court can finally find peace. Now you are ready to identify the 6 specific patterns. Recognizing them is the first step of integration. First pattern: the negative mind reader. You automatically assume you know what others are thinking about you, and it's always something negative. He's looking at me funny. He must think I'm weird. She didn't respond to my greeting right away. She clearly finds me annoying. This pattern turns you into a paranoid detective of social rejection. The shadow behind this pattern is your own projected inner critic. You assume others judge you in the same cruel way you judge yourself. But notice the hidden arrogance in this pattern. You assume that others are constantly focused on you, analyzing your every move. In reality, most people are absorbed in their own internal dramas. Second pattern: the evidence collector. Your mind becomes a meticulous archive of every social interaction that can be interpreted as proof of your inadequacy. You perfectly remember every awkward silence, every joke that fell flat, every moment you felt you didn't belong. But you conveniently forget all the positive interactions, all the times you were accepted, all the moments of genuine connection. This pattern reveals how the shadow distorts your perception of reality. You become selective with evidence, keeping only what confirms the narrative that you are inadequate. It's as if your mind were a corrupt court that only accepts witnesses for the prosecution. Third pattern: the social perfectionist. You set impossible standards for your social interactions. Every conversation must flow perfectly. Every joke must get the right laugh. Every response must be witty, interesting, appropriate. And when you inevitably fail to meet these impossible standards, you interpret it as evidence that you are a defective person. The shadow here is the deep fear of your imperfect humanity. You cannot accept that genuine connections emerge from vulnerability, not performance. That people connect with your humanity, not your perfect facade. This pattern keeps you trapped in a perpetual performance where you can never just be. Notice how these first 3 patterns feed each other. The mind reader assumes the worst about others' thoughts. The evidence collector files these negative interpretations as facts. The social perfectionist sets impossible standards that guarantee more evidence of inadequacy. Together, they create a perceptual prison where every social interaction becomes an opportunity to confirm that you are inadequate, weird, or fundamentally flawed. But recognizing these patterns is already the beginning of liberation. Because when you see the mind reader in action, you can ask, do I really know what this person is thinking? Or am I projecting my own judgments? When you identify the evidence collector, you can ask, what positive evidence am I ignoring? When you notice the social perfectionist, you can reflect, what impossible standards am I setting for myself? Every pattern that becomes conscious loses a piece of its power. The shadow operates best in the darkness of the unconscious. When you illuminate these mechanisms with the light of consciousness, when you name them and understand them, something fundamental begins to change. But there are 3 more patterns that are even deeper, more subtle, more destructive. Patterns that attack the very core of your identity, that make you feel that your existence is a burden to others. Fourth pattern: the internal devil's advocate. This voice whispers that you are a burden to others, that your needs are excessive, that you're always asking for too much. I shouldn't bother anyone with my problems. If I say what I think, I'll ruin the mood. It's better if I stay quiet. No one is interested anyway. This pattern teaches you that your presence is intrusive and your needs are invalid. The shadow here is the wound of abandonment, disguised as altruism. You'd rather ask for nothing than risk rejection. You'd rather erase yourself than expose yourself. But notice how this is actually a subtle form of control. If you never truly show yourself, you can never be truly rejected. The devil's advocate keeps you safe, but lonely. Fifth pattern, the rejection detective. You become hypervigilant for signs that you are not welcome. A slightly different tone of voice becomes proof of irritation. A shorter text response confirms the person is tired of you. An unreceived invitation is unequivocal evidence that you don't belong in the group. Your mind becomes a hypersensitive scanner, detecting rejection where there may be none. This pattern reveals how the unintegrated shadow distorts your perception of reality. You become so focused on not being rejected that you turn neutral interactions into evidence of rejection. It's like living with an emotional metal detector that is constantly beeping, finding threats in innocent gestures. Sixth pattern, the relentless judge. This is the cruelest of all the patterns. It's the voice that declares, after any social interaction that wasn't perfect, you're pathetic, you're so embarrassing, you'll never fit in, you are fundamentally flawed. This voice doesn't analyze behaviors, it condemns your existence. It doesn't criticize actions, it attacks your identity. The relentless judge is the pure shadow speaking. It is every judgment you've internalized, every criticism you've absorbed, every message of inadequacy you've received throughout your life, condensed into an inner voice that never forgives, never acquits, never acknowledges your worth. But here is the most important revelation. These 6 patterns are not truths about you. They are symptoms of a fragmented psyche, trying to protect vulnerable parts through mechanisms that have become destructive. The mind reader projects. The collector distorts. The perfectionist demands the impossible. The advocate nullifies. The detective suspects. The judge condemns. Together, they create a parallel reality where you are perpetually inadequate, constantly threatened, fundamentally flawed. But recognizing these patterns is like turning on a light in a dark basement. Suddenly you realize the monsters were just shadows cast on the walls. Suddenly you understand the prison was made of thoughts, not iron. Each time one of these patterns activates, you now have a choice. You can identify with the voice, believe its narrative, accept its verdict, or you can recognize, this is the relentless judge speaking. This is the rejection detective in action. This is the perfectionist setting impossible standards. Awareness does not immediately eliminate the patterns, but it breaks their absolute authority. When you recognize the voice of the shadow as a part of your psyche, and not as the truth of your reality, you reclaim your freedom to choose. Now comes the most important part: how to integrate these voices instead of fighting against them. The integration of the social shadow doesn't happen through struggle, but through understanding. You don't eliminate these patterns, you transform them through consciousness and radical acceptance. First move: non-judgmental observation. When one of the 6 patterns activates, your first response should not be to try to change or fight it. Simply observe. Interesting, the mind reader is active now. The relentless judge just issued a verdict. The rejection detective found another piece of evidence. Treat these patterns as internal characters with their own agendas, not as absolute truths about your reality. This disidentified observation is revolutionary. When you can see a pattern in action without merging with it, you regain your freedom of choice. You stop being the victim of your own thoughts and become the conscious observer of your internal dynamics. Second move: dialogue with the shadow. Each destructive pattern carries a distorted positive intention. The mind reader wants to protect you from painful surprises. The perfectionist wants to ensure you are accepted. The devil's advocate wants to avoid the risk of abandonment. Instead of fighting these voices, dialogue with them. I understand you want to protect me, but assuming everyone judges me negatively isn't helping me create real connections. I recognize you want me to be accepted, but impossible standards only create anxiety. I see you're afraid of abandonment, but erasing myself is not the solution. Third move, the practice of gradual authenticity. Start small. In a safe conversation, allow yourself a moment of imperfection. Let a silence exist without desperately trying to fill it. Express a genuine opinion, even if it's not popular. Ask for something you need, even at the risk of a no. Every act of authenticity is an act of rebellion against the patterns of social anxiety. Every moment where you choose to be real instead of perfect is a victory for integration over fragmentation. Fourth move, reframing the evidence. Actively begin to question the evidence collector. When your mind files an interaction as proof of your inadequacy, ask, what other interpretations are possible? What positive evidence am I ignoring? How would a person who loves me interpret this situation? Fifth move, the practice of radical compassion. The antidote to the relentless judge is self-compassion. When the critical voice attacks, respond as you would to a dear friend in the same situation. You're being human. No, there's no such thing as a perfect performance in relationships. Your vulnerability is not a flaw. It's what allows for genuine connection. Sixth move, integration through action. The patterns weaken when you act against their premises. If the rejection detective whispers that you're not welcome, choose to participate anyway. If the perfectionist demands you be fascinating, choose to be ordinary. If the devil's advocate says you're a burden, choose to ask for help. Every conscious action that contradicts the patterns of social anxiety is a step toward freedom. Because you discover, through direct experience, that the fears were ghosts, that the judgments were projections, that acceptance comes from authenticity, not performance. The integration of the social shadow is a process, not an event. But every moment of awareness, every act of courage, every choice of authenticity over perfection brings you closer to the person you have always been underneath the protective patterns. You don't become a different person. You become who you always were, without the masks of fear. You are no longer the same person who started reading this text. Something fundamental has shifted in your perception. You can now recognize the voices of the social shadow when they manifest. You can identify the patterns that once operated invisibly, controlling your choices, limiting your possibilities, keeping you trapped in a diminished version of who you really are. The internal court that condemned every gesture, every word, every moment of imperfection, has lost its absolute authority. Because now you know, these voices are not the truth about you. They are fragments of a psyche in the process of integration, echoes of wounds in the process of healing, shadows in the process of transformation. You are now the conscious observer of your own mental patterns. You are not the mind reader who projects judgments. You are the one who observes when the mind is projecting. You are not the evidence collector who distorts reality. You are the one who questions what evidence is being ignored. You are not the relentless judge who condemns your existence. You are the one who chooses compassion over judgment. This awareness is your freedom, because when you can see a pattern in action, you have the power to choose a different response. When you recognize a voice from the shadow, you can decide whether to identify with it or simply watch it pass. Social anxiety loses its power when you understand its mechanics. The fear of others' judgment dissolves when you stop judging yourself. The need for external approval diminishes when you develop internal approval. The social performance becomes unnecessary when you accept your imperfect humanity as worthy of love. You are beginning a new relationship with your social life. One based on authenticity instead of performance. On vulnerability instead of invulnerability. On genuine connection instead of superficial approval. There will be moments when the old patterns will try to regain control. Moments when the relentless judge will return with its cruel sentences. Moments when the rejection detective will find evidence that you don't belong. But now you have the tools to recognize them, understand them, and integrate them. Every social situation becomes an opportunity to practice authentic presence. Every interaction is a chance to choose reality over projection. Every moment is a possibility to be who you really are, without the masks of fear. The journey of integrating the social shadow is just beginning. You will discover that being genuine is more attractive than being perfect. That vulnerability creates deeper connections than invulnerability. That accepting your imperfect humanity is more liberating than chasing an impossible persona. Comment which of the 6 patterns resonated with you the most. Which one did you recognize as most active in your experience? Like if you felt the courage to look directly at your social shadow. Subscribe to continue this journey of integration and authenticity, because you no longer need to be perfect to be loved. You no longer need to have all the right answers to belong. You no longer need to hide your humanity to be accepted. You can simply be. Allow yourself to be who you really are. The world needs your authenticity, not your performance.